The lights of Hollywood have a way of bending reality. One moment, a name is unknown outside of family circles and industry whispers, and the next, it is stamped across studio lots, trending across social media feeds, and whispered in the same breath as Oscars, legacy, and destiny. And right now, one name is starting to echo louder than most expected. Jaafar Jackson. Not just another aspiring actor trying to break into Hollywood's locked doors, but a member of one of the most scrutinized, mythologized, and globally recognized families in music history. Because when your last name is Jackson, you are never just auditioning for a role. You are stepping into a shadow that never stops moving. And the question now circulating through casting rooms, industry meetings, and online fan wars is becoming impossible to ignore. Is Jaafar Jackson Hollywood's next Oscar winner, or is he walking directly into the heaviest legacy burden the entertainment industry has ever seen? But to understand why this question is exploding now, you have to understand what came before him and what he is about to inherit. Because this is not just a story about a young actor landing a breakout role. This is a story about legacy, expectation, and the crushing weight of a name that changed global culture forever. And somewhere inside that pressure cooker of fame and history, a career is being born, or possibly being tested before it even begins. The turning point didn't start with an awards show. It didn't start with a viral interview or a Hollywood scandal. It started with silence, then a casting announcement, and then a wave of disbelief that spread faster than anyone expected. Jaafar Jackson had been chosen to portray Michael Jackson in a major upcoming biographical film. And just like that, Hollywood stopped scrolling for a moment. Because this wasn't just casting. This was inheritance in motion. The idea of a family member stepping into the life story of the most famous entertainer in modern history immediately created a storm of emotional contradiction. Supporters saw it as poetic. Critics saw it as dangerous. Insiders saw it as one of the most high-risk casting decisions in decades. And the public? The public did what it always does when mythology and reality collide. It divided. On one side, there was awe. A belief that no actor on earth could possibly understand Michael Jackson the way someone from his own bloodline could. On the other side, there was skepticism, even fear. Because portraying Michael Jackson is not simply about performance. It is about stepping into a cultural memory that spans joy, controversy, tragedy, brilliance, and constant global scrutiny. And that is where Jaafar Jackson enters the frame, not as a pop star, not as a headline figure, but as an individual suddenly placed at the center of an emotional and cultural storm that predates him. What makes this moment even more intense is what little the public actually knows about him. Unlike many Hollywood aspirants, Jaafar did not build his identity through constant media exposure or social media dominance. He grew up within the gravitational field of one of the most famous families on the planet, yet largely outside the chaotic spotlight that consumed so many of its members. And that, according to some industry voices, may be his greatest advantage, or his greatest vulnerability. Because Hollywood has seen this story before. The child of a legacy stepping into the arena, expected to carry not only talent, but history itself. But what makes this different is the scale. This is not a famous actor. This is not even a typical music legend. This is Michael Jackson, the man whose artistry reshaped global performance, whose influence spans generations, and whose life remains one of the most dissected in entertainment history. So when Jaafar was cast, the conversation instantly stopped being about whether he could act, and started becoming about whether anyone should attempt this at all. Behind the scenes, according to industry reports, the decision wasn't made lightly. Casting directors and production teams reportedly spent extensive time evaluating not just physical resemblance, but emotional presence, movement, and the intangible quality that defined Michael Jackson on stage. Because impersonation was never the goal. Transformation was. And those who have seen early production discussions suggest that Jaafar brings something unexpected to the role, not imitation, but familiarity. A comfort within the mannerisms. A natural alignment with the physical language of performance. But even that raises a deeper question hanging over the entire project. Is this authentic connection or inherited memory shaped by proximity? And Hollywood, as always, is watching closely. Because if this performance succeeds, it could become one of the most talked about biographical portrayals in modern film history. But if it fails, it won't just be a failed role. It could become a permanent shadow over a career that is only just beginning. And that tension is exactly what makes this story so volatile. As news of the casting spread, social media erupted almost instantly. Fans of Michael Jackson expressed a mix of hope and protectiveness. Some argued that if anyone should portray him, it should be someone who understands the emotional reality behind the fame. Others insisted that no family connection could possibly translate into the artistic distance required to portray such a complex figure honestly. And then there were the skeptics who saw something else entirely. Hollywood, once again, turning legacy into spectacle. TikTok edits began circulating within hours. Comparisons were made frame by frame. Photos of Jaafar next to iconic images of Michael Jackson during different eras of his career. The resemblance, in some moments, was striking enough to fuel even more debate. But resemblance alone has never been enough in Hollywood. Because Oscar-level performances are not built on likeness. They are built on transformation, discipline, and emotional truth that survives under the most unforgiving camera lens in the world. And that is where the pressure intensifies. Because Jaafar Jackson is not just acting for audiences. He is acting for an audience that already feels they know the original story by heart. Every gesture will be measured. Every expression will be analyzed. Every creative choice will be debated in real time across millions of screens. And in that environment, even brilliance can become controversial. But there is something deeper unfolding beneath the surface of all this public reaction. A quieter, more human reality that rarely survives the noise of celebrity culture. A young artist stepping into a role that carries emotional weight not just from history, but from family. Because portraying someone who is both an icon and a relative creates a psychological tension that most actors will never experience. Where does performance end and memory begin? Where does study end and identity begin? And what happens when the world no longer separates the actor from the legacy they are portraying? These are the questions that now hover over Jaafar Jackson's path forward. Not as headlines, but as pressure. And Hollywood understands something the audience often forgets. The Oscar conversation does not begin with awards night. It begins the moment expectation becomes heavier than the work itself. Right now, Jaafar Jackson stands at that exact intersection. Where opportunity and scrutiny collide, where legacy becomes both invitation and interrogation, and where every step forward will be watched not just as entertainment, but as history in the making. Because this is no longer just about a role. It is about whether a new generation can carry a story that already feels complete in the public imagination. And as filming moves forward and anticipation builds, one question continues to rise above everything else. Not just whether Jaafar Jackson can deliver a performance worthy of awards, but whether Hollywood is witnessing the beginning of a breakout career, or the beginning of one of its most difficult legacy stories yet. And in a city built on reinvention, that question is never asked lightly, because sometimes the most powerful roles in Hollywood are not the ones that win Oscars. They are the ones that decide what comes next. And yet, as Hollywood continues to whisper his name, something unexpected begins to happen beneath the surface of all the speculation. The conversation slowly shifts. At first, it was about casting. Then it became about resemblance. Then legacy. But now, it is becoming about something far more dangerous in the entertainment industry. Expectation. Because expectation in Hollywood is never neutral. It does not sit quietly in the background. It builds pressure. It distorts perception. It rewrites how every move is interpreted before it even happens. And for Jaafar Jackson, that pressure is beginning to take shape in ways the public cannot fully see. Inside industry circles, according to sources close to production discussions, the tone is not one of certainty. It is cautious, measured, Almost like everyone involved understands they are standing on the edge of something that could either become cinematic history or a cautionary tale studied for years. Because portraying Michael Jackson is not just another biopic role. It is entering one of the most emotionally charged identities in modern entertainment history, a figure adored globally, yet endlessly dissected, celebrated, yet controversial, human, yet mythologized beyond recognition. And now, that entire emotional contradiction is being placed onto a single performance, a single actor, a single last name, Jaafar. And the industry is asking a question it rarely asks this early in a career. Can someone so closely connected to the subject maintain enough distance to create art instead of memory? But that question itself reveals something deeper about Hollywood's psychology. Because Hollywood loves authenticity until it becomes uncomfortable. It celebrates legacy until it feels too literal. It praises risk until the outcome is uncertain. And right now, Jaafar Jackson exists at the exact intersection of all three. The announcement of his casting didn't just trigger excitement. It triggered analysis. Every movement, every interview clip, every public appearance began to be re-examined under a new lens. Not as a young performer building a career, but as a potential carrier of one of the most complicated artistic legacies of all time. And that shift is not something most audiences fully notice. But it changes everything. Because once the narrative locks in, it becomes difficult to escape. And the narrative forming around Jaafar Jackson is becoming increasingly powerful. He is not just acting as Michael Jackson. He is stepping into Michael Jackson. And that distinction, subtle as it sounds, is the difference between a performance and a cultural event. Meanwhile, inside the production world, attention is reportedly focused on something far more technical, but equally intense. The physicality, the movement, the micro-expressions, the way Michael Jackson carried himself when he wasn't performing versus when the stage lights changed everything. According to industry commentary, those closest to the project have emphasized that this is not an imitation exercise. It is an emotional reconstruction. And that is where Jaafar's preparation becomes crucial. Because learning to move like Michael Jackson is one thing, but understanding why he moved that way is something entirely different. And that is where the weight of inheritance becomes both fascinating and complicated. There is a belief among some observers that Jaafar's advantage is not simply genetics or resemblance. It is proximity. He did not study Michael Jackson from a distance. He grew up in the orbit of his presence. He absorbed the atmosphere, the silence, the intensity of a life lived under constant global attention. But proximity does not automatically translate into mastery. And Hollywood knows this better than anyone. For every legacy story that succeeds, there are dozens that collapse under the pressure of comparison. And comparison is already building at an accelerating pace. Online forums have become battlegrounds of interpretation. One side insists that only someone within the Jackson family could possibly capture the emotional truth of Michael's life. They argue that outsiders would inevitably reduce him to imitation or caricature. The opposing side pushes back with equal intensity. They argue that closeness to the subject can blur artistic boundaries, making it harder to create honest distance. And somewhere between those two extremes, Jaafar Jackson is trying to exist as an actor, not a symbol. But symbols are what Hollywood creates. And once created, they are difficult to escape. As filming discussions continue, attention has also turned toward the emotional responsibility of the role. Because portraying Michael Jackson is not just about dance or voice or visual accuracy, it is about stepping into a life that contained extreme highs and devastating lows. A life lived under surveillance from childhood. A life shaped by fame so intense it became inseparable from identity. And for Jaafar, that emotional terrain is not theoretical. It is personal history. And that is where the psychological complexity deepens. Because actors are usually taught to separate themselves from their roles. But what happens when the role already exists inside your family narrative? What happens when the story you are telling is also the story you have lived beside your entire life? These are the questions that no press release can answer. And they are the questions that critics are beginning to quietly raise. Not out of hostility, but out of fascination. Because Hollywood rarely sees this level of narrative convergence. A global icon, a family connection, a cinematic portrayal, and an industry desperate for authenticity in an era where audiences increasingly distrust polished performances. At the same time, the entertainment world is watching another layer unfold. The business reality. Studios are well aware that biographical films about legendary figures carry enormous financial upside, but also enormous risk. Success can redefine careers. Failure can freeze them. And when the subject is Michael Jackson, the stakes multiply exponentially, because the global audience is not just large. It is emotionally invested in ways few other musical legacies can match. Every region of the world has its own version of Michael Jackson's influence. Every generation has its own memory of his impact. And that means every audience member brings their own expectations into the theater before the film even begins. And expectations like that are impossible to control. Meanwhile, social media continues to intensify the pressure cycle. Fan communities break down every detail released publicly. A single behind-the-scenes photo becomes 1,000 interpretations. A short clip becomes a debate about artistic legitimacy. A rumor becomes a trending topic. And through it all, Jaafar Jackson remains largely outside the noise, which, according to some observers, may be intentional. Because in high-stakes Hollywood storytelling, silence is not absence. It is strategy. But silence also creates space for projection. And the public has never been more skilled at projecting narratives onto unfinished stories. Some already see him as the emotional heir to a cultural legacy. Others see him as an experiment in casting philosophy. Others still see him as a young performer being placed under a microscope far too early. And none of these narratives require his input to grow. They evolve on their own. That is the reality of modern fame. A reality that is now colliding directly with his career at its earliest stage. And as production continues, one underlying truth becomes harder to ignore. This role will not simply define how the world sees Jaafar Jackson. It may define how Hollywood thinks about legacy casting itself for years to come. Because if this works, if the performance connects emotionally, critically, and culturally, it could open a new category of storytelling. One where legacy is not just portrayed, but inherited in performance. But if it fails, even slightly, it may reinforce Hollywood's long-standing hesitation to merge family history with cinematic representation. And that is why so many eyes are watching. Not just fans, not just critics, but executives, casting directors, filmmakers, and actors who understand exactly how rare and how fragile this moment really is. And somewhere inside that tension, a quiet truth begins to emerge. Before awards, before reviews, before box office numbers, there is always a moment in every career where potential is defined not by achievement, but by expectation. And Jaafar Jackson is standing directly inside that moment right now, where the story has not yet been written, but everyone already believes they know how it should end. And that is where the real pressure begins.